There's a way of thinking about morality that begins with a seductive promise, the promise to end the confusion, of replacing the chaos of conflicting intuitions, of emotions that cloud judgment, of traditions that vary from culture to culture and from era to era, with something clean, objective, verifiable. The promise of transforming ethics into something as rigorous as physics, as precise as mathematics. You would no longer have to wonder if something is right or wrong based on how you feel, or what your parents taught you, or what your religion prescribes. You would calculate, you would measure. You would arrive at an answer that any rational person, anywhere in the world, at any time in history, would also arrive at if they did the math correctly. This promise is the promise of utilitarianism. And it was done with complete seriousness and with genuine conviction by some of the most brilliant and best-intentioned thinkers of the last 3 centuries. People who truly believed they were doing something extraordinary for humanity by proposing this system. People who wanted to reduce the world's suffering, who wanted to end unnecessary cruelty, who wanted to build a rational basis for social reforms that would make human life genuinely better. And the result is a theory that, in its most consistent and boldest forms, produces conclusions that most human beings find disturbing. Not because the theory is wrong in its calculations, but because the coldness of the calculations reveals something about what happens when you try to reduce morality to arithmetic, when you try to make people numbers, when you remove from ethics everything that is not measurable and comparable and summable. What remains may be logically consistent. But something was lost along the way, and the question is whether that something was disposable or whether it was the heart of morality itself. To understand utilitarianism with the depth it deserves, one must begin not with the theory itself, but with the problem it attempted to solve. At the end of the 18th century, Europe was undergoing unprecedented social, political, and economic transformations. The French Revolution had shaken the foundations of the entire established political order. The Industrial Revolution was reorganizing work, family, and the structure of cities in ways no one had anticipated. The old justifications for social inequality based on tradition, divine hierarchy, birthright were losing legitimacy. In this context, Jeremy Bentham, a British jurist and philosopher of extraordinary prolificacy and eccentricity, proposed that the basis of morality and legislation should be a single principle that he called the principle of utility. Nature, wrote Bentham, placed humanity under the rule of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They are the ones who point out what we should do and determine what we will do. The criterion of goodness or badness of an action is its tendency to increase or decrease the happiness, understood as pleasure and absence of pain, of the person or people whose interests are at stake. What made Bentham's proposal revolutionary was not just its content, but the radicality of its implications. If the criterion of morality is the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain, then no tradition, no authority, no established prejudice can oppose this criterion without justification. Practices that cause suffering without producing compensatory benefit are simply wrong, regardless of how long they have existed or who advocates them. And reforms that reduce suffering are mandatory, regardless of how much discomfort they cause to those privileged by the existing order. Bentham applied this principle consistently and sometimes shockingly by the standards of his time. He argued for the decriminalization of homosexuality decades before any other prominent thinker, based on the simple argument that if an act between consenting adults causes pleasure to the participants and harms no one, then criminalizing it is simply adding unnecessary suffering to the world. He argued in favor of prison reforms, based on the idea that prisons that make inmates miserable without making them less prone to crime are simply useless. He argued that the interests of animals should be considered in legislation, because the ability to suffer, not the ability to reason or speak, is what determines whether a being has morally relevant interests. The question is not whether animals can reason or speak, but whether they can suffer. This last point revealed something about the internal logic of utilitarianism that many of his contemporaries found uncomfortable, but that Bentham insisted was a necessary consequence of the principle: morality has no boundaries defined by biological species, or PIA, it-group affiliation, or geographic proximity. It extends to every being capable of pleasure and pain, regardless of any other criteria. This was subversive not just of human social hierarchies, but of the entire traditional way of thinking about who or what counts morally. John Stuart Mill, who had been educated by Bentham himself and his father James Mill in one of the most intense experiences of intellectual education in modern history, inherited utilitarianism and tried to refine it. Mill realized that Bentham's utilitarianism was vulnerable to the objection that he treated all pleasures as equivalent in quality, different only in quantity. If this were so, a world full of dull, satisfied people might be morally superior to a world of intellectually sophisticated, moderately happy people, as long as the sum total of pleasure was greater. Mill tried to resolve this by introducing the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Intellectual, aesthetic, and moral pleasures are qualitatively superior to purely physical pleasures. A small amount of superior pleasure is worth more than a large amount of inferior pleasure. And who can judge? Anyone who has experienced both types. Mill famously asserted that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than to be a satisfied fool. But this modification created a problem that Mill never resolved completely satisfactorily. If you allow qualitative distinctions between pleasures, you need some criterion for making those distinctions other than pleasure itself. You are implicitly admitting that there is something beyond pleasure that has value, that certain states or activities are intrinsically better regardless of how much pleasure they produce. And this is a concession that seems to compromise the purity of original utilitarianism. Henry Sidgwick, the late 19th century British philosopher who many consider the most rigorous and honest of the classical utilitarians, looked most directly at the internal difficulties of the system. Sidgwick spent decades trying to construct a completely consistent utilitarianism and came to conclusions that deeply disturbed him. The most disturbing was what he called the dualism of practical reason. Sidgwick recognized that there are two systems of practical rationality that are both defensible on their own terms, but that often conflict. Rational egoism, which says that each person should maximize his or her own well-being, and utilitarianism, which says that each person should maximize total well-being. And Sidgwick could not find a purely rational argument that would resolve this conflict in favor of utilitarianism. Practical reason is divided against itself, and the choice between selfishness and altruism appears to be, ultimately, a choice that pure reason cannot resolve. Even more disturbing was what Sidgwick called esoteric utilitarianism. If the goal of utilitarianism is to maximize total well-being, then it can sometimes be the case that total well-being will be maximized if most people do not know that utilitarianism is true. Because if people knew that utilitarian calculation could justify violating any rules in extreme circumstances, they might use this as a pretext to violate rules when convenient for themselves, producing worse results than if they simply followed the rules without question. Therefore, utilitarianism could require that utilitarians who understand the system not disseminate it widely, and that they instead encourage popular belief in absolute moral rules that they themselves know are not absolute, one morality for the enlightened and another for the masses. Sidgwick recognized that this was deeply problematic for any notion of moral integrity, but he could not see how to escape this implication within the terms of the system. 20th century utilitarianism deepened and diversified these questions in ways that the system's founders had not anticipated. A fundamental distinction emerged between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism, which is the purest original version, says that each individual action must be evaluated by its result in terms of total well-being. Rule utilitarianism says that we should follow the rules that, if followed generally, produce the best results in terms of total well-being. Rule utilitarianism was developed in part to escape the more disturbing conclusions of act utilitarianism. If you follow general rules like don't kill innocents or don't torture, even when in particular cases violating the rule would produce more well-being, you avoid the extreme cases that make act utilitarianism seem monstrous. The problem is that rule utilitarianism is accused of collapsing into act utilitarianism in any situation where following the rule clearly produces less well-being. Why should follow the rule when you know that violating it would produce a better result? Philosopher and biologist Peter Singer became, in the second half of the 20th century, the most consequential and courageous defender of utilitarianism, especially in its implications for our treatment of animals and our obligations to global poverty. Singer accepts the system's most uncomfortable conclusions and defends them with a consistency that his admirers find admirable and his critics find disturbing. In relation to animals, Singer argues that treating animals cruelly in factory farms, in laboratories, and entertainment is a prejudice analogous to racism and sexism. We discriminate against beings based on morally irrelevant characteristics, in this case, the species, instead of based on the morally relevant characteristic that is the capacity to suffer. If a pig can suffer as much as a human being of similar intelligence, then the pig's suffering has the same moral weight as the human's suffering. Any other criterion is speciesism, an unjustifiable prejudice. In relation to global poverty, Singer developed the argument that became known as the obligation to give. If you can prevent something really bad from happening, like a child dying from malnutrition, without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, you have an obligation to do so. If this is true, then every time a person in rich countries spends money on anything beyond basic necessities, while there are children dying from preventable causes that could be treated with that money, he is making a moral error, not a small mistake. A mistake equivalent to letting a child drown when you could have saved him. Most people reject this conclusion. The most common rejection is that there is a moral difference between actions and omissions, between actively causing harm and failing to prevent harm. Causing someone's death is morally worse than letting someone die, and therefore not spending money to save children you've never met is morally different from actively killing them. Singer responds that this distinction is psychologically understandable but morally indefensible. What matters morally is the result, not how the result is produced. A child killed by your inaction is no less dead than a child killed by your action. The suffering is the same, and if the suffering is the same and you had the power to prevent it, your failure to prevent it is morally equivalent to your action in causing it. Bernard Williams, one of utilitarianism's most profound and influential critics, identified what he considered the theory's fundamental defect, its incompatibility with personal integrity. Williams argued that utilitarianism treats the moral agent as a neutral vehicle for maximizing well-being, devoid of projects, commitments, and relationships that are genuinely his or hers. But personal projects and commitments are not obstacles to morality. They are constitutive of the agent's identity. A moral theory that requires you to abandon your projects and commitments whenever utilitarian calculation demands, it is not making high moral demands on you. It is asking you to dissolve as a person. Williams used the example of Jim, a botanist who is traveling through a South American country and encounters a squad of soldiers about to execute 20 prisoners. The commander offers Jim a choice. Jim can kill one of the prisoners, and the other 19 will be released. If Jim refuses, all 20 will be killed. What should Jim do? Active utilitarianism has a clear answer. Jim must kill the prisoner. 19 lives are saved. The calculation clearly favors this option. But Williams argued that this answer ignores something fundamental: the special relationship between an agent and her own actions. There's a profound moral difference between Jim killing someone and Pedro, the commander, killing someone. Jim and Pedro are not in the same moral position regarding the situation. Jim has a special relationship to what he himself does that utilitarianism simply cannot capture because it treats all causalities as equivalent. The utilitarian rejoinder is that Jim's sense of his special relationship to his own actions is a form of moral luxury. Jim is putting the purity of his hands above 19 human lives. And this seems like a form of selfishness disguised as principle. But Williams would respond that it's not about purity of hands. It is about recognizing that human beings are agents with first-person perspectives, with projects and commitments that constitute who they are, and that a moral theory that does not recognize this is not describing the morality of real human beings. It's describing a morality for robots that have no identity of their own. What makes utilitarianism the coldest moral theory in history is not that its defenders are cold. It's the opposite. The great utilitarians were moved by genuine compassion, by a burning desire to reduce the world's suffering. The coldness comes from the structure of the system, from its insistence on eliminating everything that is not measurable and comparable, on treating each life as a unit of well-being that can be added, subtracted, and compared with other units of well-being. Of accepting that if the numbers say you should do something, you should do it, regardless of how repugnant it seems to your deepest intuitions. And perhaps this is the most important lesson that utilitarianism offers, not as a recipe for action, but as a diagnosis. It forces us to ask, where does our money go and why? Why do we treat beings who can suffer as if their suffering doesn't count? Why do we think that the suffering of those who are far away matters less than the suffering of those who are close by? Why do we find reasons not to act when the consequences of acting would be uncomfortable for us? Utilitarianism does not answer these questions in a way that everyone will accept. But the merit of doing them with the implacable coldness with which he does them is real and permanent. Because sometimes it is precisely the coldness of calculation that reveals the selective and convenient warmth of our compassions.